The Day of the Rope by Devon. Author's note. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you for purchasing my book. I spent countless sleepless nights writing it. I hope you find it thought-provoking and unique. I would also like to say this is a work of fiction. This is not a prediction of the future or even a fantasy of the present. It's just a story, and any connection to real-world events, places, or people are all just coincidences and nothing more. Enjoy. Devon. Chapter 1. Laughter escaped Ethan's lips, but it was cut short immediately. He hadn't expected to laugh like that. Not out loud. Not at all. The hysterical edge he detected in his unexpected outburst reignited his paranoia. He glanced around, scanning the faces of everyone inside the metro car with him. Had they noticed? Nobody seemed to be aware that he even existed. Ethan was very familiar with this. He'd been commuting in and out of the city on the Red Line for years and had never had a conversation with anybody that he could remember. There were only those occasional awkward moments when some urine-stained lunatic would try to solicit money from him, or lost tourists would ask for directions to the various monuments. A new and increasingly common phenomena was the sudden appearance of large groups of pushy black teenagers that abruptly performed half-baked performance art pieces that were supposedly about racism. The teens would loudly shout platitudes about bigotry and bias as the train moved between metro stops. These performances always ended with the mildly threatening requests for donations from their captive audience. If nobody took the bait, the teens often got aggressive, with whichever white passengers looked easiest to intimidate. The teens would point with their phones at their victim, call them racist, and shout nonsense about white privilege until the mark invariably either fled the train or paid off the teens to avoid confrontation. Many of these passengers were government employees or contractors, and the last thing they wanted was to play a starring role as the evil white racist in the next viral outrage video. Ethan avoided these situations the same way most people did. He simply avoided eye contact at all costs, even if it meant pretending to be intensely interested in the bits of left-behind garbage and filth on the floor and seats of the metro car. He felt bad for the tourists who were intimidated into handing over their cash. Most of the time, these were patriotic retired folks who had spent most of their lives getting fleeced by the ruling class that operated out of the cities above. Now, here they were spending some of their savings to see their nation's capital. Seeing, but not really seeing. It angered Ethan to know that if Norman Rockwell were alive today, he'd be forced to paint an elderly war veteran wearing a foreign-made We the People t-shirt purchased from a gift shop from someone who didn't speak English, getting shaken down by these illiterate delinquents in a graffiti-covered underground train. All the tourists had gone now. Most of the car's inhabitants had their noses in their phones. Some were tapping and sliding their fingers across the screens as the rest of their bodies swayed rhythmically in unison to the thumping and squealing sounds coming from the wheels of the car below, as it bounced and scraped against the track beneath them. None acknowledged his presence. The hypnotic blur of brick and concrete just outside the dull window took no notice of him either. It did, however, remind him to pay attention to the next stop. Was he out of the city yet? It seemed like just moments ago that adrenaline had been splashing through his veins. He had been pushing and shoving his way into the metro car alongside the others like suit-clad, tie-wearing salmon. He had been acutely aware of everyone around him. Now, it seemed his brain chemistry was struggling to return to normal. The adrenaline had run its course, and it had turned sour in his blood. He suddenly found it difficult to keep his balance as the metro car bobbed up and down. His grip on the stainless steel hand railing made his arms seem stiff and corpse-like. His knuckles were white as bone. The rest of his body swayed in reaction to the car's movement, not unlike a rag doll attempting to look dignified. There was no reason for him to remain standing like this. The car was no longer packed full of the odd mixture of aspiring deep staters and welfare recipients. The trail mix of people that had occupied the car when he had first fought his way through the automatic doors and boarded the train at the Chinatown station had thinned out significantly. Nearly all of the sociopaths in wool suits had exited at DuPont Circle. They had filed out like well-behaved robots, never looking up from their phones. Everyone else had all but evacuated too. The few people that remained were staring intently at their government-issued devices, playing mindless freemium games, and listening to music too loud with their earbuds. It could be heard over the blaring sounds of the track coming through the floor. He knew several seats were now available if he wanted to sit by himself. Instead of sitting, he maintained his death grip on the metal handrail. The rail he had been clinging to for how long had it been? It seemed strange, as if he'd always been in this car, in this position, and at the same time it felt as though he had only just arrived. Both feelings aroused an anxiety about his inevitable departure from his sanctuary. Being inside the metro car was like being inside a machine capable of freezing him in time. He knew once he walked through the automatic doors and through the turnstiles that the world would once again resume at normal speed. He realized that he was rapidly approaching the end of the line. Soon he would have to face this new reality that he had chosen for himself. Tonight's work was almost done. Had it really been that simple? There were only a few things left for him to do, but for the most part, it seemed that his plan had worked. There was just the simple matter of finding a cab without the help of his phone. He wasn't completely sure cabs still accepted cash. They had to, right? An electronic bell crackled from an antiquated PA speaker system above Ethan's head, followed by a voice grunting, "Twinbrook, doors opening on the right." The sloppy, unconcerned tone of the engineer's voice reminded him of the morbidly obese TSA agent that had felt him up earlier this week, with her disgustingly fat fingers. Fat, greasy fingers stuffed inside light blue rubber gloves that were much too small for her bulging hands. Why had she seemed so smug? It was as if she was savoring this tiny sliver of power she perceived having over him. At the same time, there was a carelessness about her conduct that would have been comforting had he been an actual terrorist, which of course he wasn't. Not then. Is that what he was now? His mind wandered from the repugnant TSA agent to the apathetic cashier that had checked him out at the grocery store the day before. Checking him out without saying a word. She had just glared at him expectantly, after carelessly tossing his items into the plastic bags that she had then heaved unceremoniously onto the counter. The bags that he had to pay extra for, thanks to some leftist hysteria about plastic bags. A hysteria that he didn't quite understand. He had stopped trying to understand. In me, they see no real threat, he had thought. I'm simply the piñata they lower from the tree. They lower me down from the tree to keep these animals from climbing it. I'm the sacrificial lamb, the sedative. I'm the pacifying feast that is prepared for these people. Maybe that's when he decided he'd be the first one, the first lamb to grow claws and fangs and feast upon those who had bred him for the sacrifice. Living in D.C. had given him a front row seat to the decadence and decay. The nauseatingly seductive atmosphere of the city that made the promise to its wretched inhabitants that if you just pay along and thank the masters for your miserable table scraps, then maybe, one day the masters you find might find you deserving of a seat at the table. Then, if you were lucky, you might be permitted to gorge yourself on a minuscule portion of the ill-gotten bread. Wasn't that what he had been doing? Enduring all the hubris and not in the hopes that someday he would have his turn? The steady process of degrading himself in every way imaginable had been the formaldehyde that had preserved the remains of his ambitions. He had coveted the pleasures that were advertised in real time on the social media feeds of his superiors. In his delirium, somewhere in the endless line of compromises, he had had enough. That was when he had discovered the list. At first, the list had seemed like the deranged fantasy of crypto-anarchists, and maybe it was. After all, this was technically the first real beta test. There was no guarantee that any of this was rooted in reality. But that was okay. He had made peace with the very real possibility that this was just an elaborate hoax. He wasn't doing this for the money anyway. It was worth the risk. Someone had to be the first. The hardest part had been overcoming his obedience to the programming that had been carefully stitched into his brain. The hypocritical codes of conduct that had been imprinted on the minds of those of his species who, like him, were born into the lower classes, which is to say, every class that wasn't the ruling class. This was the programming that included all sorts of unquestionable concepts, like the idea that decisions concerning who lived and who died could only be made by those who had been born into the ruling class. Whether it was a decision to kill a single citizen or hundreds of thousands, even millions, this power was reserved exclusively for the ruling class. Never mind that the upper levels of this hierarchy consisted of the worst humanity had to offer. It was they, and they alone, who possessed the authority to determine the fate of everyone else. And everyone seemed inexplicably satisfied with this arrangement. Ethan rejected this. He also rejected the fairy tale known as the American dream. The mirage that was nothing more than a carrot forever dangling just out of reach. The appropriately named dream had to be recognized for what it really was. It was an unattainable prize that held the ambitions and the attention of the citizens captive. A dream that prevented people from seeing where they were really headed and who they really served. It was the cruel comfort of a violent parent promising an abused child that the beatings would stop as soon as they learned how to behave. The classic American rags to riches tale that was promoted throughout the culture. The pot of gold at the end of the American rainbow was complete fiction. Sure, there had been a few exceptions. There would always be outliers and statistical anomalies. However, for all he knew, Even these rare instances might not be as organic as they seemed. For as long as Ethan had been alive, the White House had been occupied exclusively by millionaires and billionaires, and it wasn't as if, though the members of Congress were the working class, salt of the earth types, they in no way resembled the men described in the storybooks read in government schools. The banking system was just a sophisticated system of slavery that was marketed so well that everyone was just fighting to the death to become the noble alpha slave. It was so obvious to Ethan now. He sometimes wondered if the system had been subverted at some point in the past or if it had always been a lie. But it didn't really matter. What mattered now was that he knew he was being exploited by people who had not earned and did not deserve. Their positions that were held together by imaginary frameworks. These were intangible structures that consisted of self-appointed royal bloodlines, oligarchs, and banking dynasties. Nearly every decision these sociopaths made was to secure their position of power within the architecture they had created and eliminate any possibility of competition. They were the divine few, always justified in their choices, no matter what the cost to the people like them. It was the people like him that the ruling class had been working diligently against for decades, if not longer, working to strip away any remaining residual power that might threaten their legacy. When these autocrats weren't developing new ways to devour their own countrymen, they were sending hundreds of thousands of these ignorant wretches, sometimes even millions, to their deaths. Countless nobodies had died in wars so that the elites might enrich themselves or secure their legacy. Nobody ever called them murderers. No matter how high the bodies were stacked, countless men, still under the spell of the American delusion, had lined up for the slaughter of generation after generation, all of them vying for the chance to have their name carved into a war memorial. This was the closest a piñata could ever come to immortality or having a legacy. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Ethan finally understood the truth. The truth that might have saved the lives of these men with engraved names had they experienced the same awakening. Had these dead men truly believed in their final moments that murdering the enemies of the ruling class was so noble, breathing their last breath so that there might be more oxygen remaining in the wind for the elites and their bloodlines? Was it honorable for these fallen men to leave their offspring alone on this earth, to fend for themselves under the rule of those who had sent them to die for their own personal gain? Ethan was appalled by this tiny minority that had managed to amass so much control over the rest of the species. That they had fooled so many people into believing that murder, sanctioned by them, was no longer murder. That it only became murder when it wasn't explicitly in the interests of their bloodlines. What had made their interests so damn righteous, other than their place in the hierarchy? Nothing, he had decided. Rejecting their authority and their claim to their positions in this imaginary institution had been easy. He had never ceded power to them. He had never agreed to be their servant. He never consented to the murders they committed in his name. He rejected utterly the premise that when they kill, it is noble and good, but for him and people like him, it was forbidden. He would not submit to this system. The system that was intangible and existed only in the abstract, and only in the minds of those who did submit and obey. Having this knowledge made him ponder the methods of the ruling class of generations past. the ancient ancestors of the elite that centuries ago had sought to prevent people like him from gaining knowledge through reading the written word. That had been a power reserved only for them, and this, too, was a power that they must guard jealously. But the veil had been lifted, and now the list would do for killing what the printing press had done for literacy. Perhaps that might be overstating it, he thought. All the same, using the list, he would claim this forbidden power and reject this universally held delusion that murder was a weapon reserved only for them. It amused him that, despite their conspicuous efforts to promote moral relativism and degeneracy, that there were still a few commandments that the ruling class needed people like him to obey. He was no longer governed by these laws, written by others to control him. He didn't accept the title of murderer. He had merely acquired a more complex understanding of the term, the same way the ruling class had when they wanted to achieve their goals, by any means necessary. By discarding the rules branded on the flesh of the slaves at birth and adopting the laws that govern kings, he had evened the playing field and become one of them. Hadn't many of these so-called ordained risen to power through exploiting this same loophole? Wasn't that the rush of power he'd experienced when he'd... Shady Grove. Doors open on the left. This is the end of the line. The speaker above squawked and buzzed. The car was empty now. He released his grip on the railing and stood unsteadily facing the door. His face was so close to the plexiglass window his nose was almost touching it. He waited in anticipation for the train to come to a stop and for the automatic doors to open. For some reason, he'd always felt a rush of power when the mechanical doors opened. He supposed this was a tiny taste of the drug that the ruling class was addicted to. If something as insignificant as a motorized door bending to your will delivered a perceptible amount of dopamine into your system, then just imagine how the ruling class feel all the time, he thought. He didn't have to imagine. He was now one of them, and he did feel that power. He had taken that power. He had taken it from Adam Ehrenberg. The doors of the metro car opened. He was disappointed to note that instead of the usual micro-pleasure he had felt in the past during these moments, when the physical world bent to his will in this tiny yet satisfying way, he felt nothing. He supposed power must be like a drug after all. Perhaps the recent dosage increase had overwhelmed his system and made him numb to the simpler pleasures like this. He wondered momentarily if this phenomena explained why the ruling class seemed to develop an appetite for the kind of extreme depravity that had led to the creation of the list. The nightmarish lusts that had justified the list's ruthlessness. He would have to remember to manage his doses. If things went well with Ehrenberg, maybe he shouldn't rush right to the next one. Ehrenberg's name was one of the first names on the list, which was arranged in alphabetical order. But that's not the only reason he had chosen this name for the beta test. Anons had put together quite a dossier on Mr. Ehrenberg, as they had for most of those on the list. But Ehrenberg's bounty had reached a staggering $1.7 million in less than 24 hours. The bounty had surged when he was identified as one of the men in a particularly horrifying snuff film that had surfaced on the dark web. $1.7 million in crowd-sourced privacy coins was made payable to anyone who took his name off the list. And there was only one way a name could be removed from that list. The blockchain made sure of that. At least that's the idea, he mused as he exited the metro station through the turnstiles. This was the first real-world test. Ethan wouldn't know for certain until he received confirmation that the funds had been transferred to the address he had provided, the smart contract. Until then, his only reward was the unshakable feeling that by touching one of the untouchables, and by imposing his rule on them, he had become the fire that would fight their hellish fire. He had rejected his assigned seating in the hierarchy and entered the space reserved for gods. Too bad I can't control the weather, he thought to himself. It had started raining, and the only cabs he could see were working for rideshare companies that used apps that tracked location data. Just as he was about to lose hope, he spotted an old light blue Crown Victoria parked along the sidewalk near the bus stop. He opened the back door to the cab. The driver, who was talking on his cell phone, looked at him in the rear view. He was an Arabic man in his 40s and seemed less than enthusiastic about having a new customer. According to the license taped to the dashboard, his name was Mohammed. "Can you take me to Silver Spring?" Ethan said. "Silver Spring? I guess." "Okay," said Mohammed. Ethan nodded and crawled into the back of the cab, which, because of the make and model, felt like the back of a police car. "Just take me to downtown. You know where the Gem is?" asked Ethan. Mohammed said he did, and they left the metro station parking lot. The rain began to pick up, and the sound of the windshield wipers transitioned from rhythmic to almost soothing, to a level just below frantic. "You take cash, right?" End of chapter 1.